my first MacBook that I remember owning myself was that first gen MacBook Air. You remember that one? That was the one
Hmm.
Steve Jobs came out with the manila envelope under his arm and he did the presentation or whatever. And he pulls this laptop out of the envelope, right? And at the time, it's hard for folks to visualize that now because everything is so thin and so powerful now. But at the time, laptops were like pretty thick, machines, right? The MacBook started making them. The MacBook Pro started getting smaller and smaller, but he whips out this MacBook Air. It's super thin. It's super powerful, and it was nothing that anyone have ever seen before that, right? And I remember being in love with that, right? It was a full laptop, thinner on one side than the iPad and anything else. So that was my first one. I loved it ever since. I still recommend the MacBook Air, although it's not as magical as it used to be. Right? It's still a really good machine, and it's still super thin, super light because that's the focus of it. But do you remember what your first MacBook was?
I do. And before I tell you that, the MacBook Air is still the machine that most everybody else should buy. We're
I
still
think
both
so.
saying that. So even though it may not be
Yep.
quite as magical as it was back then, it's still the one that most everybody should buy. And we'll get into that a little bit. But
Right.
so I remember my first MacBook, but I want to go back even further. So we had Macs in our computer lab at the high school that I went to, and
Okay.
I was an editor on the school paper, so I was helping put the paper together. So I did stuff on that. But when I graduated and went to college, I took all of the money everybody gave me, and I got the Mac Macintosh Color Classic. So it was
Okay.
the first all-in-one, and it was, it wasn't very big. I think it had 4 MB of RAM or something like that. But
Right.
that was the first Mac that I ever owned myself. So that was really cool. I thought I was really awesome because I had a color computer and it was a Mac and it worked
Yeah.
fine. And I bought it at the University of Utah bookstore, and they did have education discount back then. So that was my very, very first Mac. My first MacBook was when I first started my consulting company in 20 end of 2019, first of 2020, and that was a MacBook Pro, Intel, one of the lower end ones of those. So that was my first MacBook. That one
Yeah.
wasn't magical. It still had the butterfly keyboard. So
Yeah.
I probably should have got the Air at that point, but I didn't. So yeah. So Color Classic, look it up, man. It was a great device, and I remember. So I had it for a year for college, and then I went on my mission for 2 years, and it sat in a box. And
Mhm.
then I came home and used it that next year for college. And I remember a few years later booting it up because I wanted to play Where in the World is Carmen San Diego, which
Right.
was a really great game on that Mac. So, and I remember how long it took to boot up, and I said, "Yeah, never mind."
Yeah. Yeah. And that was one of my first questions too, um, when you were doing your setup and testing. And again, I don't want to spoil anything. We're going to talk about that, but I remember, going from some of those older Macs and at jobs and stuff like that, and all the way to this M2 that my wife uses, and it seems like it's never really off to me, right? The boot up is just so fast from being totally off to booting up to where you can actually use it. It's like crazy fast, and it never seems like it's off. So I figured that it would improve a whole lot, with your M3, and you timed it,
Yep,
and yeah, I was impressed.
yep.